Okay, can
I
everybody see that?
I can see your screen.
All right, great. So yeah, the title of class this morning is Deschooling Society, an Introduction to the Educational Critique of Ivan Illich. So briefly, we're going to talk about who Illich was. He's a fascinating character, perhaps one of the most kind of polarizing intellectuals of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. He died back in 2002, I think it was. But a lot of his work, a lot of the things that he was criticizing, he was very, very critical of the development industry, of these massive projects, influx of aid into rural communities. He was also very critical of the medical industry, very critical of the amount of energy that society was using. He had a wide range of critiques, but all of it was based kind of on this appreciation for traditional cultures and appreciation for indigenous societies, for place-based peoples, for traditional ways of living. And so following from kind of this appreciation for place, he became very, very critical of what he called the professionalization of education. So we're going to talk a little bit about who he was. We're going to talk the kind of the common theme running through all of his work was a defense of human agency and autonomy, that he believed that people did best, communities did best when they were able to provide for themselves as much as possible, right? And this is something that I think that we've shared throughout many of the classes I've shared. I've made the argument that community development is best when people are able to provide for themselves as locally as possible. We've talked about local economics. We've talked about the importance of place-based agriculture, of defending the commons, of all of these different kind of ideas that result from when people have control over the lives they live, right? And if we look at most people today around the world, there is a tendency against kind of a movement against human autonomy, of being able to provide directly for yourself as closely as possible to the geographical space where you live. The tendency today is globalization, is extremely long and complex supply lines, the professionalization of every service. Where most people used to grow at least some of their own food in their backyards. Today, the vast majority of young people don't know where food comes from. They've never put their fingers in the soil. They've never grown things. They've never known a farmer. And so all of these things are kind of a movement away from localization, from place-based living, and from human agency and autonomy. And we see in the academic work and the studies and the research of Ivan Illich, a very, very kind of profound and reasoned critique of this movement, of this professionalization, of this uh, not relocalization, but the opposite of localization, the globalization of everything. And then quickly, his main book related to education is called Deschooling Society. It's something that really kind of put him into the spotlight back in the 1970s. He was kind of one of the first people who kind of questioned what most people never question, right? So one of the things that I always noticed when I worked in the development industry was that um, of all of the different types of projects that one could do, if somebody mentioned that they were involved in promoting education, then that was kind of universally accepted as something good, as something beneficial for a community, right? So, a small NGO came up with a plan to give scholarships to students in a rural community, and that was kind of universally kind of applauded. Oh, that's a great effort. But very, very few people ever stopped to kind of question, what was the effects of these types of projects? What was the effects of promoting education? What type of education? What did that support local communities? Did that strengthen local communities? Or in opposite, did it kind of force young people to abandon their local communities in search of jobs in other places, right? And that's one of the things that Illich in his book Deschooling Society, I want to look at. What he critiqued is he's like, look, throughout the developing world, throughout Africa and Asia and Latin America, when young people are sent into professional mandatory public schools, It's essentially a brain. It's a what the term that we use today. It's the first step in the brain drain. It's about removing young people from a type of life, a lifestyle that generally worked okay. Not to say that there wasn't problems with scarcity and issue and sometimes with droughts and poverty issues and all that. But no, it generally was a healthy lifestyle that people had carved out together as a community, the development of culture as a response to how to respond to these places, and all of the traditional education that went in to how these local cultures really survived in place. And all of a sudden, you have these schools come in and essentially tell young people that all of this traditional knowledge was useless or was secondary, that what they needed was this professional curriculum that that was going to help them get ahead. And get ahead inevitably meant leave behind, right? Leave behind the rural places, the small villages, the areas, the traditional cultures where you grew up, and seek out more money, insertion into the monetary economy, more purchasing power, more consumerism through your education, through the professionalization of your knowledge. And Illich was very, very critical of that, as we'll see. And then kind of at the end, I want to try and connect. I think there's a connection, a very, very real connection between the critique of Ivan Illich that he makes in Deschooling Society and the educational philosophy of AIU, of Atlantic International University. I've been offering classes here for about a year and a half, and something that I appreciate is um, that there is a difference between, I think, what the classes that AIU offers, how this educational alternative is structured, as compared to maybe a traditional university, and especially compared to grade schools and things like that. And then at that, I want to try and make a connection to the present day. Illich was obviously writing 50 years ago now. He published Deschooling Society, over half a century ago. But I think that a lot of those critiques are very, very present today with some of the modern day kind of technologically based threats to education. So I want to kind of look at one of the main issues that's coming, which is the use of artificial intelligence in education and how that is a threat, right, to a decentralized, empowering type of education that seeks to empower human autonomy, right? Following this vein of thought from Ivan Illich. So let's talk real quick about who he was. Ivan Illich was originally born in Austria, and he was actually a Roman Catholic priest. For the first years of his life, he studied theology, but then he eventually stopped practicing. He never left the church, but he did stop practicing priesthood because he wanted to focus freely on his academic critiques of modernity. And he felt that the church was kind of this limiting factor. They were always trying to shut him up and kind of keep him within the bounds of traditional thought. And he wanted to be free to express his thoughts, so he kind of left the practice of priesthood. And throughout his life, throughout his research and his studies and his academic pursuits, he argued very persuasively that the benefits of most modern technologies, societal institutions, social arrangements were illusory, and that still further, such elements undermined human self-sufficiency, freedom, and dignity. Right. So right away, if we were to kind of sum up his thought, he critiqued and kind of went against the grain of the progress narrative, right? This kind of myth of development, of progress, that humanity is on an upward scale and that modernity is leading us towards ever greater pursuits of wealth and more consumerism and more stuff and longer lifespans and this and that. And he said that no, what we see in modernity is the professionalization of everything, the installation of ideas, false ideas of scarcity, increasing dependence of everybody on things that are created by big governments, by big corporations, and in response to that, loss of humans' self-sufficiency, of the ability of individuals and small-scale communities to provide for themselves, and the freedom and dignity that comes with that type of lifestyle. So throughout his life, he focused this critique on a wide variety of issues. This was kind of the main theme, like I said, but he wrote very, very persuasively against the medical industry, about a lot of the abuses of doctors and kind of medical corporations against the ability of people to take care of themselves. Obviously, the educational institutions, which is what we're going to focus on today. He also talked about gender issues, transportation, etc. Um, like I said, this importance of human agency and autonomy, the ability to subsist through one's own work, through one's own bodily efforts, through one's own autonomy over the things that are important to you in life, was kind of the main kind of source of his inspiration. During his time, during the 1970s and 80s, obviously, especially during the 80s, there was this huge movement of moving away from subsistence, right? So in the world of community development, there's this whole idea that subsistence agriculture, that subsistence livelihoods were backwards. They were what keeping people away from modernity, away from ever greater sources of wealth and affluence. And so there was this whole idea about how to take rural communities and move them away from subsistence, right? So let's move them from subsistence farmers to larger scale production, monoculture production for world markets. Here in El Salvador, there was a movement, obviously, to try and convince small farmers to no longer grow corn and beans and vegetables and things like that for their own consumption, but rather to turn their lands over to coffee production, to sugarcane production, whatever it might be, commodities for the global market. And then after that, let's move people off of the land altogether, move them into the cities where they can be, labor force for industry and for commodity production. And then, even better, let's move them away, have them migrate to the United States. But this whole movement against subsistence. And Ivan Illich he was a passionate supporter of subsistence. He was one of the few people still today that see something positive in the idea of subsistence, in autonomy, in providing for oneself, not just individually, but as a small scale collective, right? He believed that modernity imposed upon humanity certain tools or technologies and social arrangements that deprived individuals and small scale communities of the ability to, and this is a quote, enrich the environment with the fruits of his or her vision, right? So today, most people, when they talk about the food we eat, the homes we live in, the energy we use, it's no longer really the fruit of our vision, the fruit of our labor. It's something that we purchase kind of through this commodity driven life. Most people today, have a job where they do one task daily, and then they receive a monetary income, and they trade that for food and energy and housing and all of the needs that human beings need. And he says that no, by imposing this, we lose the ability to enrich our environment with what we want, right? With what we can provide for ourselves. The institutionalization, the centralization, and the industrialization of all facets of life and society, from health to education to transportation, replaced what he called the vernacular forms of responding to the felt needs of a place and a people. And this is a quote from one of his books. The general framework implied here is that every attempt to substitute a universal commodity for a vernacular activity has led not to equality, but to a hierarchical modernization of poverty. Step by step, the war against subsistence has defined as commodities what was essential for living communities, and in each case has resulted in new hierarchies and new forms of domination. This might seem kind of abstract, but I think it's very important. Let's read this quote again, but let's try and utilize the framework or the language of education, right? So he says, in every attempt to substitute traditional educational methods for public imposed state-led education has led not to smarter people, right? Not to more affluence, but to a hierarchical modernization of poverty. So in the educational realm, young children have a natural tendency to want to learn. And place-based communities always came up with ways to provide satisfaction for this desire to know, right? That's one of the things. I have a 1.5-year-old daughter, a 5-year-old son, and a 9-year-old daughter, and their passion for learning is natural. It's not something that me or my wife have to try and impose upon them. It's something that we want to that exists naturally, right? Young people want to learn about the world, about their place in it, about the society, right? And small scale communities traditionally came up with traditional educational forms that responded to that natural need. But all of a sudden, with the professionalization of education, with the advent of mandatory schooling and public curriculum defined by the state, all of a sudden there's this idea um, uh, of education as a commodity, right? Now young people, instead of being pushed to discover the world in the natural way, they're competing against each other to see who can get the best grades, right? They're competing against each other to see who can be the best in class, who can show most skill for requiring, the predetermined curriculum of what young people need to know. And so all of a sudden this creates a hierarchy, right? There's people who are good at that type of education and people who are not good at that type of education. And what we get is a stratification of society, right? So this professionalization of the educational institution did not result in better education, did not result in more learning. What it resulted in was a more uh, a stricter form of hierarchy, of stratifying society, right? And again, he uses this term vernacular. Vernacular is kind of like vernacular language. It's like the traditional language. Or we also use the word vernacular architecture, right? So traditional homes, like you see here, as opposed to the type of modernist architecture with blocks and steel and big windows, kind of the type of professional architecture that architects and professional builders do. But vernacular, according to Illich, comes from an Indo-Germanic root and implies rootedness. Vernaculum, as a Latin word, was used for whatever was homebred, homespun, homegrown, homemade, as opposed to what was obtained in formal exchange, right? So one of the things that Illich did is he took this word vernacular and he used it to all of the different needs of humanity, right? So we can talk about vernacular education, right? Different types of educational methodologies that came, from homebred, homespun, homegrown, things that responded to the particularities and contextuality of place, right? Sustenance, according to Illich, sustenance derived from reciprocity patterns embedded in every aspect of life, as distinguished from sustenance that comes from exchange or from vertical distribution, right? And so this is what he based his critique on of modernity, right? Was that instead of this rootedness of these patterns that grew out of reciprocity between people and their environment, people and their neighbors, all of a sudden we have this sustenance that comes from just exchange. And he said that professionalized modern day education is a form of sustenance that comes from exchange, right? If you come from a wealthy family, you pay for a good private education for your children, right? Or you purchase the best books, or you buy the best tutors, whatever it might be. Whereas, traditional educational methods wasn't focused on this kind of dividing of young people, but about trying to help young people discover, how they can provide for the community, how they can make community life better. And again, through his career, he was very, very critical of all of these different aspects of how vernacular forms of livelihood were being attacked. And he says this is interesting. This isn't necessarily something that's just happening today. It's something that has happened historically. And he says that from the 9th to the 11th century, the idea took shape that there are some needs common to all human beings that can be satisfied only through service from professional agents. Thus, the definition of needs in terms of professionally defined commodities in the service sector proceeds by a millennium the industrial production of universally needed basic goods, right? So this idea that there are some things that we all need. We all need education. We all need to learn certain things, and that this can only be provided by experts, right? By people who are experts in education. expert pedagogues, people who have studied and learned this, that all of us need medical care. And that can only be provided by doctors, right? That every other attempt to educate our children, every attempt to take care of ourselves, of our own health, are pale in comparison to what can be provided by professionals. And Illich was very critical of that. He said, no, there might be a space, obviously, for professionals, for research, and all of these things, but taking care of one's health, taking care of the education of young people in a traditional society happens naturally, right? And these vernacular expressions offered a lot of value, things that we need to value and we need to understand, right? So again, how does all of this connect to education? For Illich, the process of learning occurred spontaneously, right? Like I was mentioning, young people, one of the most famous kind of educators, John Holt, is a person that I really like. And one of the quotes that he has, he says that the main critique of schools today is that a young child who at age 4 and 5, before they go to school, is just fascinated with learning. There's this natural tendency to want to learn and everything, to, they interact with the world, they touch things, they ask questions, they want to understand everything. There's this natural desire to learn. And then after a couple of years of mandatory public schooling, most young people hate school. They don't want to wake up in the morning. They fight with their parents. They don't want to do that. That switch from this natural tendency to want to learn to all of a sudden to actually hate the process of learning is a condemnation of what schooling done, of what the professionalization of education does, right? And for Illich, trying to find ways to rescue these traditional, natural occurring reciprocity of learning methodologies, in vernacular communities was what was important. Learning was both a natural human tendency, a curiosity, and the logical response of rooted communities to train future generations for their subsistence and well-being. These vernacular expressions of education were all about how can young people learn what they need to learn to subsist, to live well, to take care of the ecological sanctity of the place, to take care of the natural resources. How can they learn certain things that will enrich this place where we want them to live, right? With the institutionalization of education through mandatory public schooling, there was this kind of false scarcity was imposed by the concept of learning having been monopolized by professional teachers and institutions. So when we started to have this shift in our inner mindset, maybe a century ago or so, that learning only occurs in schools, that education only occurs in schools, then all of a sudden, in order to get ahead, in order to provide the best possible education for your child, you have to compete against other children, right? You want your child to go to the best school. You want them to have the best teacher. You want them to have the best books, the best access to libraries, the best access to technologies, whatever it might be, right? And that was the result of this monopolization of who owned the right to educate children, right? And Illich says that no, that's false sense of scarcity ruined education. It ruined the natural ability for young people to learn kind of spontaneously and to learn, through all of these natural methods that communities had created. Illich, again, his most famous book was Deschooling Society. It was published in 1971, and he presented schools as places where consumerism and obedience to authority were paramount, and genuine learning was replaced by a process of advancement through institutional hierarchies, accompanied by the accumulation of largely meaningless credentials administered by professionals. Suddenly, you were educated if you received a diploma or a GDP or whatever it might, or some sort of paper that showed that you had finished the curriculum that was preordained. Learning did not mean that you necessarily knew things, that you had necessarily gained knowledge that was going to be useful to yourself, to your community, right? Mass education then was seen as another aspect of the war on the vernacular, that theme running throughout Illich's whole kind of professional career, and the subsequent loss of human agency and autonomy. Illich, all of his books were kind of like very, very pamphlet forms. They were very rarely more than 100 pages, and he crammed an enormous amount of ideas and thought into these tiny pamphlet style books. And every sentence is kind of just filled with so much meaning that you can reflect on. And so I tried to pull a few of my favorite quotes from Deschooling Society. I'll share two or three of those quotes. But what he says is that most learning is not the result of instruction. It is rather the result of unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. Most people learn best by being with it, yet school makes them identify with their personal cognitive growth with elaborate planning and manipulation. Again, right? This natural tendency to learn by simply being present to a place, by listening to people who are around you, by interacting with the natural world. And yet today, schooling is the exact opposite of that. We close up young people in these schools where they spend 7 to 8 hours a day. There's mandatory curriculum. A lot of times, creativity is punished. Natural, traditional ways of thinking or even kind of spontaneous creativity is punished. We want people to respond to what we need to learn. In today's society, this massive focus on STEM, science, technology, education, engineering, and math, as opposed to all of the other things that can be learned, is kind of a result of this imposition of instruction over true learning. Another interesting quote here, he says, schools are designed on the assumption that there is a secret to everything in life, that the quality of life depends on knowing that secret, that secrets can only be known in orderly successions, and that only teachers can properly reveal these secrets. An individual with a schooled mind conceives the world as a pyramid of classified packages accessible only to those who carry the proper tags, right? Again, this false scarcity of knowledge, that in order to enter into the hierarchy of the educated, you have to kind of pay your dues, spend a certain number of years in schools, do a certain amount of activities, right? A few other quotes. The pupil is thereby schooled to confuse teaching with learning, right? And there's a big difference between teaching and learning. He confuses grade advancement with education. This idea that if we keep going up the scale from first to 12th grade, and then undergraduate, and then postgraduate, and then doctorate, that as we continue to go up this kind of this step ladder, we are not necessarily educating ourselves, but we are advancing. He confuses a diplomacy with competence and fluency with the ability to say something new. His imagination is schooled to accept service in place of value. Another quote, oops, sorry. The public, try to move this so I can read it. The public is indoctrinated to believe that skills are valuable and reliable only if they are the result of formal schooling. And this is a big one in rural communities. I live in a very, very rural part of El Salvador where the vast majority of families are farmers. And most, when young people go to school, there's this assumption that everybody believes in, that traditional farm work is undervalued. It's not a valuable skill. Young people who go to school, we expect them to leave behind this kind of manual labor, the traditional ways of subsistence agriculture, so that they can do other things, work as a computer programmer, work in a bank, work in the financial sector, work as a business entrepreneur. Um, and that only these skills, which they acquire through schooling, are valuable. Traditional skills that you learn outside of the school atmosphere are devalued. And now, again, that was another thing that was very highly critiqued by Illich throughout his life. And then the last quote is, everywhere, the hidden curriculum of schooling initiates the citizen to the myth that bureaucracies, guided by scientific knowledge, are efficient and benevolent. And so he said, one of the worst things that happens in schools is that young people come to think that their parents and their grandparents and the elders in the community and the traditional farmers and the midwives, the holders of traditional knowledge, are not those who possess most wisdom. That, in schooling, you learn that the teacher has knowledge and you need to appropriate that knowledge from him or her. Right? It is the expert. It is the bureaucracy. It is the institutionalization of knowledge which must be acquired. right? And that again goes against this tendency that knowledge is free, is available. It's natural for people to seek out these things. Um, so what did Illich propose, right? So instead of, this kind of educational framework, he said in place of compulsory mass schooling, Illich suggested it would be preferable to adopt a model of learning in which knowledge and skills were transmitted through networks of informal, involuntary relationships. It's important to note that Illich was writing before the time of the internet, right? It's not where you have all of these MOOCs, these massive online courses, or where people can access an enormous amount of knowledge and information, YouTube tutorials and online public libraries and all of these things. But he was kind of pre-visualizing this idea, this space where people could, learn what they wanted to learn through these informal and voluntary relationships, not just through forced participation in compulsory schooling. The most radical alternative to school would be a network or service which gave each man or woman the same opportunity to share his current concern with others motivated by the same concern. So again, Illich was very, very critical of this idea that there are experts, that we have to come to experts, right? So today, I don't want to come before you all as an expert in deschooling society. Rather, as a place, this is something I care about. I hope that this is something that you all care about as well, and that we can enter into a dialogue. We can talk. We can share concerns. In another space, I would be able to learn from you all. But the kind of this, again, this mutual reciprocity of a shared learning atmosphere. That's what Illich hoped for, right? He hoped for the creation of educational webs. Again, this was pre-internet age, and he was using already these ideas of webs and networks, which heighten the opportunity for each one to transform each moment of his living into one of learning and sharing and caring. And so what does this have to do with AIU? I'm going to make the argument that I think that there are a lot of similarities and shared kind of values between Illich's critique of professional education and what AIU offers, right? So these are a few things that I've pulled from AIU's website, kind of that outline what is AIU's educational philosophy. And it says, AIU says on its website that the act of learning is endogenous from within rather than exogenous, right? I think I remember reading a while ago that the Latin root for education or to educate comes from educare, which means to pull out or to extract from within, right? This whole kind of this Greek idea of helping people to understand things they already know, right? To try and draw out what's already within us, rather than exogenous, this idea that only an expert knows what needs to be known and that we have to extract that knowledge from him or her, right? And so for AIU, the act of learning is endogenous. It's about finding your own passions and learning what's already kind of this seed which is within us. Also, obviously, AIU is directed towards adult learning instead of child learning. So, in andragogy, as the recognition of the innate capacity of adults to learn autonomously. That word obviously resonates very, very strongly with Illich's philosophy, this focus on human agency and autonomy, that people can learn driven by self-motivation, self-evolution. The educational model of AIU is carefully crafted to nurture self-monitoring, self-motivating learners, fostering an environment where curiosity knows no bounds, right? You all are here this morning because you want to be, not because you're being forced to, because if you don't show up, we're gonna put a check on your attendance record, which is what happens at schools. It's about being driven, being self-motivated, self-evolving, saying, I want to learn this. This is something that's important to me. Some of the principles of AIU's educational philosophy include self-instruction, self-guidance, collaborative development of curriculum unique to each student. Not this idea that there is a curriculum imposed by the government, imposed by a certain educational elite, that this is what you have to learn. No, that there's a collaborative development. What we learn is going to be unique to ourselves, to our communities, to our history, to our culture, and the ability to kind of create these curriculums with on an individual basis instead of imposing this is what you need to learn, right? Flexibility of time and place of study, obviously. And then the idea of omniology, right? Omniology is a word that means the study of everything, right? Not just STEM, not just science, technology, engineering, and math, not just new computer programs, but this idea of being open to all of the different things that we can learn. We recognize, AIU recognizes that the world is a tapestry of interconnected disciplines, and true wisdom lies in understanding their interrelationships. At AIU, we encourage our students to embrace the freedom of academic inquiry, fostering a spirit of intellectual curiosity that knows no limits, right? This is what AIU offers. And the question I have is this type of education, this opening to all types of knowledge, of encouraging people to discover what's within them, their own passions, uh, getting away from this idea of a strict curriculum that everybody has to learn certain things. Is this possible not just for adults like us who are here today, but also for children? I'm in the process right now of trying to educate my own children who are, again, 1, 5, and 9, and I think that it's possible. I look at my 9-year-old daughter and see her natural curiosity for the natural world, her flourishing artistic ability, and I see my son, who's so much different, who has this scientific mindset, who's always breaking stuff and trying to put it back together, seeing what's inside. There's natural tendencies that are already visible, in my 9-year-old daughter and my 5-year-old son. And how can we create education that spurs that on, that allows them to really discover that, and also on a community base, so that they're not just learning things that are going to expel them from their community, but they're learning things that will allow them to really try and offer something of value to this place that has nurtured them, that I hope that as a father, I hope is a place where they will be, where they will want to live, right? Um, Real quick, I wanted to end with kind of a modern, I got about 10 minutes left, a modern kind of issue that I think is very, very related. Again, Illich was writing all of this back before the age of computers, before the age of when every child had a smartphone and everybody was addicted to their technologies. Um, but today, one of the main things that's coming, I think, is this idea of artificial intelligence tutors, right? These AI personalized tutors that are going to be there to tell our young people what they need to learn. And this idea of having this tutor that is with them 24 hours a day, that knows algorithmically how they learn, what they learn. And these tutors will supposedly make the educational process much easier, much more efficient, but at what cost? And I think that question right there, at what cost, is not necessarily being questioned. There's a very, very interesting author that I would recommend to all of you. His name is Zach Stein, and he's an educator, someone who has studied education, is very critical of education, and is very, very critical of this idea of instilling technology into educational spaces without questioning at what cost. And I have a few quotes from one of his books. He says, "We are giving teacherly authority to a machine, and also endowing the machine with hyperstimuli in the domains of persuasion, charisma, intimacy with our children. So it will become the most charismatic teacher you've ever interacted with. This AI tutor will be way more entertaining and knows you better than your mom or dad possibly could. And it will talk to these children about anything they want in a way that's precisely attuned to what they need to hear. It has access to all the knowledge in the world, and yet it won't show up as anything but a little puppy if that's what you want. If that's what you want it to be. It's this very shape-shifting surround sound in augmented reality, ever-present, quasi-humanoid tutor, which obsoletes human relationship, right? So this idea, my young nephews, I feel that as an uncle, I've kind of lost connection with them because they've grown up in a single-parent household where the mother is out working. My sister-in-law is working, 8, 10 hours a day, and they've been raised by screens, right? They've been raised by the computer games, by the smartphones. And I kind of feel like when I go, they're more interested in their computer games than what their uncle has to say. And I think most people kind of understand that that's kind of a direction. What happens when we obsolete this kind of human connection, this traditional way of learning of parents and other people in the community, and neighbors and elders and grandparents and good teachers, interacting with young people, and all of a sudden we obsolete that because now there's no need for parents, there's no need for grandparents, there's no need for teachers because we have the AI tutor. Zach Stein says, I could easily see a future in which we actually replace parents and teachers with artificial intelligence, tutors, and machine intelligence socialization systems, which are probably moving beyond screens and into augmented reality and virtual reality, right? All of these new technologies, which are invasive and immersive and take people away from the real physical dimension of life. The encroachment of AI into the world of education will only further destroy vernacular educational traditions and the ability to learn autonomously, right? It might make traditional or schooling or this professional idea of education more streamlined, more efficient, but at what cost, right? At our ability to discover what's within us, at our ability for young people to interact with the world and their community, of the ability of the community to impart its own vernacular traditions, to share what's important for individual peoples and places. We're going to sacrifice all of that because it's easier to give our children a screen and say, learn, right? Learn what this AI tutor wants to tell you. And so what can we do about that? Here's Zach Stein. This is his book. If anybody wants to look it up, it's a great book called Education in a Time Between Worlds. And he very, very similarly to Ivan Illich, but now writing in the age of the internet, right? He says that what we need, instead of just kind of handing over education to AI tutors, we need a distributed educational hub network, pop-up classrooms defined by time and skill sharing, where there's not just one teacher, but anybody can be a teacher because all of us have skills. All of us have knowledge. Where people in a shared community can learn skills, share skills based on real needs, self-selection, self-reflection. This network should allow people to be engaged in real work that needs to be done in the community. Instead of an abstract class about biochemistry, for example, let's get together to clean up a pond. The pond needs to be cleaned up, biochemistry needs to be learned, and the kid doesn't feel a sense of being told that the world's a mess, but he has to wait 17 years before he can get some kind of job, and then maybe he'll be able to help with it. So that's kind of a vision that Zach Stein puts out for how we can rescue education. And to end with, I wanted to share a really unique experience that I was very fortunate to be a part of called the Ixil University. In Guatemala, the Ixil people are a Mayan ethnic group in the highlands of northern Guatemala. And very, very traditional society. They still speak their own language. If you can see, they have their own kind of dress, traditional dress. Most people continue to live in rural areas, growing corn and beans and vegetables as kind of this traditional way of life. But in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a huge penetration of public education. So in every tiny village in these most remote communities, young children are sent to school. And what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that these forced education have kind of come in and told young people that being a small corn farmer is not what they should aspire towards, that they should aspire for more and greater things. And the best way to get ahead in life is to pursue higher education. And so what has happened is then there's been this kind of generational break. Young people go to school, they stop speaking their traditional language and they start speaking Spanish, which is kind of the colonial tongue. They learn different ideas and they devalue the traditional forms of knowledge of their parents and grandparents and their traditional communities, right? And then they finish their education and they move into the nearest big city, right? And they have this expectation that there's going to be work, but the economy doesn't keep up with the education and there's not work for all of these thousands of young people flooding into the community. And so what you have is kind of these tiny slums of people living paycheck to paycheck, constantly searching for work. They abandoned this fairly stable decent lifestyle of small scale agriculture in hope of something better, and it didn't. The promises of education didn't come to fruition, right? And so the elders, the grandparents and the traditional healers and the midwives, they all came together about 12 years ago now, and they said, look, education has not worked. This model of mandatory public schooling, teaching a design curriculum that comes from the outside, that teaches our children things that supposedly they need to learn in expectation that they're going to make lots of money and insert themselves in the monetary economy, it's not working. It hasn't worked for our children. It's divided our communities. It's created this kind of generational gap. Something needs to be done. And so the elders came together and they created what they call the Ixil University. And the Ixil University is an educational alternative, and it's open to anybody. There's no prerequisite that you have to attain a certain level of schooling before you can come in, but it's a space where classes are offered in cornfields, in sacred caves. The teachers are the traditional healers, the midwives, the traditional farmers, the elders who impart traditional forms of justice when there's some sort of argument or disagreement in the community. It's about sharing traditional forms of knowledge that have held this community together. A cultural response to how to live well in this tiny little mountain enclave, which is where the Ixil people live. And what has happened over the last 10 or 12 years is that hundreds of young people have gone to the Ixil University and they learn. They learn about traditional methods of spirituality, traditional forms of growing food, traditional forms of justice, traditional forms of healthcare, of midwifery, of all of these traditional aspects that made these Ixil people who they were, right? And afterwards, after they cemented and learned to respect and value and revalue this traditional knowledge and these traditional sources of wisdom, then these young people went out and they went to traditional universities, right? They continued their education, but they were no longer subject to this mind manipulation of saying that everything you came from is bad, is backwards, and what we offer is better. Now they had this critical mindset, and they were able to interact with people from the outside in a way that said, we value who we are and we want to learn new things, but not because we want to escape our community and leave it behind, but because we want to bring, some of the value of things from the outside world into our traditional communities. And the Ixil University was fundamental in doing that. And changing education is something that extracted value, that extracted and expelled young people from the traditional communities and traditional way of life to education as a way to enrich what already existed. And it's still ongoing. It's a fascinating example, I think, of how education can be repurposed, how we can critique modernity in the vein of Ivan Illich and try to extract or try to find value again in